Greetings, peace, and power from the Afro-Descendant Nation. Uh, Thank you for those who are turned in and will be tuning on to the uh, recurring lesson from yesterday, which is going to be much of the same. So if you tuned in yesterday, this is going to be a repeat lesson, and we will entertain all questions and comments from everyone. First of all, to give you an update, we are now 5,000 citizens strong in the Afro-Descendant Nation Confederation. This is a confederation of all of our people, at least a representative of the Muslims, Moors, the Black Indian tribes, our organizations. We have over 100 organizations and 5,000 citizens, and we're about to do something really, really special. I said that though to say this. With our 5,000 citizens, we can do something really, really special. But this piece is really for the 45 million of us that are suffering and have suffered because of the atrocities that have been levied on us since our encounter with the colonial powers. So we intend to be at least 100,000 strong by the time of the next elections, and hopefully 1 million strong. We're going all out to expand our national influence. The reason why is that we have to negotiate, which is a different paradigm than what has been done before as a simple minority. And that's one of the main concepts that we're going to talk about today, is about how we've shifted out of the simple minority status into this special citizenship free association status called an insular nation. It's a very different status. Simple minority status is a status that the colonial powers gave us after the Civil War as a minority citizen, which is a fruitless inferior category, because minorities always lose. It's just the nature of the numerical nature of what a simple minority is. A simple minority is just that. It's a minority. It's someone that can vote but can never win because they don't hold the majority. So we've been in that catch off category because of the fact that we have not, as to date, been wise enough to try to move out, or to move out of that category. We have just moved out of that category. And in fact, we have filed a request with the United Nations. This is the UN Committee on Decolonization. The UN Committee on Decolonization came into being in 1960. And this was at the time that the African nations, as well as the Asian nations, as well as the Asian nations, were under the colonial powers, up under the colonial rule of the colonial powers. And when they came out of that yoke of oppression from the colonial powers, they did that as a colonial people. Unfortunately, instead of following that lead and following the concepts of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and the nationalists into becoming being a nation and being decolonized, we unfortunately got hoodwinked into going into this simple minority status and continuing with that, and praying for civil rights legislation, which has, as you know, have been fruitless since then. So what's the difference? It's a huge difference. As a special minority, and we're going to talk about how we have used our evidentiary skills and of history, anthropology, forensic science, DNA, to prove that we are indigenous people of the United States. We are, and our scholars have given us the evidential roadmap of our existence here in the American continent for over 100,000 years. Africans have been in the Americas for over 100,000 years. This preceded the Asian admixture by 94 to 96,000 years at least. It wasn't until recently, about 6,000 years ago, that the Asian migrations came into the United States, um, and amalgamated and intermixed with the African Aboriginals, which made up the people that we call Indians. I know that we don't learn this in school. Of course, we would not learn this in colonial school, because that is their weakness, is the fact that they are a colonial people. And we're going to talk about occupation and what are the rights of colonial people, what are the rights of indigenous people, and how to get out of this simple minority paradigm. So I'm going to bring on several pieces of work. One is by one of our UN human rights defenders, Elena Porter, and we're going to talk about occupation of colonial people or indigenous people. Colonial people are people that have been colonized by the colonists. And of course, you know, American history. It was the 13 original colonies. It was the 13 original colonies who began the occupation, the illegal occupation of the United States, and they extended that through a confederacy, and much like our confederacy, confederacy is a joining of disparate. In this case, was disparate colonies. In our case, it's disparate organizations, tribes, Muslims, Moors, Indian tribes, to confederate or to come together in a nation so that we can have collective power. And that's what a confederation is. We have come together into this 5,000 citizen nation that we are now expanding to 100,000 and 1 million. Now, what difference, or what is the superior quality of a nation? What power does a nation have? The power that a nation has is tremendous. It has tremendous economic power. And that was one of the reasons why we chose a national structure, because a nationalization of our interests and of our assets takes us from being poor individuals into being rich as a nation. How does this happen? In the United States, because of the configuration and our population in the United States, and the money that runs in and out of our hands because we're not nationalized, is $1.4 trillion. Let me repeat that. We, as a African encapsulated, enslaved, formerly enslaved people, have a gross national product of $1.4 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars a year that runs in and out of our hands because we have not nationalized that asset. If we nationalize that asset, we would go from being poor individuals, oppressed individuals, into becoming the 12th wealthiest entity in the entire world. How does this happen? We just happen to be in the middle and in the midst of a superpower that we built up a tremendous economy that is one of the largest economies in the world. Our 1.4 trillion is just a part of the 17 plus trillion dollars that the United States has as a gross national product for the year. Our $1.4 trillion, if we had control of it, we would be able to not only rectify our poverty issues, but we would have state-of-the-art schools. We would have our own police department that would be retrained to be a domestic police department, as opposed to the occupying police forces that we have in our communities, who are trained in military tactics and are policing us as if we are in a war zone. our the I don't want to say our, but the police departments all across the nation have been trained by the Israeli government, and they are policing us just like the Israelis police the Palestinians. This is the reason why we have so many fatalities because of the way that we police. So, by nationalizing our assets and nationalizing our jurisdiction, we will be able to have control over who our own police force, our own educational system, our own food security, our own transportation system, and our own environmental concerns. This is an extreme problem because in some of the far reaches of our nations, in the Mississippi Delta, for example, in the Mississippi and Flint, we have a severe water problem and a poisoning problem because of that. We have severe sewage problems in some of our areas that need to be rehabilitated and built up. Nationalization allows us to have, be able to obtain billions of dollars in infrastructure funding. So, on top of being our citizens being protected and being able to control their own institutions, they will also be able to afford their upkeep because we will be able to obtain not only state and federal funding, because this does not take us out of American citizenship. In fact, this is a move, a positioning move that will give us 3 citizenships: Confederation citizenship, we retain American citizenship, and we will be able to obtain African citizenship because we have the right to return to Africa because we were unduly uh, captured by the Africans, deprived of our land rights and our citizenship rights, and shipped off and sold to the United States and other countries. This is a disruption of an illegal disruption of our African citizenship rights. So we have the right to have that return. We have the right to American citizenship because we have been in the Americas for so long. We've been in the Americas 100,000 years prior to the colonial powers coming to the Americas. And I'm going to show you a clip by one of our experts, David Imhotep, who has written a book called "The First Americans Were Africans." We also have the erudition of Dr. Clyde A. Winters. We are in final negotiations with both of those fine scholars, so that because we have about 80 pieces of 80 approaches to evidentiary pieces, from artifacts to metallurgic evidence to skeletal evidence to DNA evidence, forensic evidence that shows that we have been in the Americas this long. And in order to find that out, the best witness is the earth itself. When we dig into this earth, we can go down wherever you're at right now. When you dig into the earth has a historical record of who's been there, what they've done. We have those records. And we can prove that we have been in the United States for this place called the United States and the Americas, Brazil, all over for over 100,000 years. Hence the reason why we changed our moniker from the American Institute of Human Rights, which was appropriate at the time, from the African Institute Descendant to the Afro-Descendant Institute of Human Rights and to the Afro-Descendant Nation, not because of my opinion, because I'm a lawyer. I go with and I am informed by the experts in cases. If it was a medical case of medical malpractice, I would go with the medical doctor's expert testimony as to what is medical malpractice. In order to proceed on a case of historical malpractice, I go with the experts on history, anthropology, DNA, archaeology, forensic DNA, and this are the experts that we would bring forth before any type of international court, any time international forum, before the state legislatures or federal legislatures of the United States, to show that we are not simple minorities who always lose, and that you can just lord over. We are the original occupiers of the land. So, and of course, this is backed up by international law. And I'm going to show you a fine PowerPoint by one of our UN human rights defenders, Elena Porter. It's called Occupation and Beyond. I'm gonna put that on the screen, and so that you can see what our argument is. And it's called Occupation and Beyond: Afro-Descendants' Right to Resist Apartheid and Colonialism Using International and Human Rights Law. The key concept, one of the is belligerent occupation, because this is how we define the United States, and this is how colonial powers are defined when they use force to conquer, to conquer or to occupy another nation. In a war, and the transatlantic slave trade is a misnomer. That was not it was a trade to them, but they were at war with us, and we are prisoners of that war. And the people who put us into that war, it occupies part of our territory, because we are an admixture of all of these population waves that came into the Americas, starting with the ancient Paleo-American population wave that was African, followed by the Nubian wave from East Africa and West Africa. There was two waves. One came out of the Nile, and that is probably our first wave. But there's a close second wave, and it's debatable that the first wave came out of East Africa into Southeast India, into Indonesia, into Australia, and then into the tip of South America by the Khoisan people. And Dr. David M. Hoptep is going to talk about the original navigators, the initial human navigators that populated the entire world were the Khoisan people, and this is Click people, and they talk a Clickish language, which is the oldest language in the world. They occupied Europe, they occupied China, they occupied. These are the people, when we say that, and we go back and we talk about the out of Africa theory, and it's not a theory, it's based upon DNA and what's in the ground, the historical record that's in the ground that supports that the Khoisan people were the originally. These are the short people. In Europe they call them the leprechauns, and in East Africa they called her Lucy. Very short people, about 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet tall, but had the power of navigation, the power over weaponry, knew how to make tools, and definitely knew how to survive and navigated the entire world. The people that came to the United States were these people. That was the first wave. We call them paleo, and the scientists in America and the genealogical scientists call that the Paleo-American. We are the Paleo-American, or the Khoisan people, as well as the people that came out of East Africa into those areas of Khoisan. The Khoisan people are from South Africa, and the other wave came from East Africa. This was the original wave. And then the Nubian wave was the second wave that came out of Egypt into the Mediterranean. And at the tip of the Mediterranean, and I lived there for about 2 years in the tip of Morocco. This is the Straits of Gibraltar. This is the segue, an entry point into a very powerful current that takes you straight to the United States, takes you straight to the Gulf of Mexico, and Mexico, takes you straight to the Caribbean. And there's historical records in each of those areas to support those notions, because again, the earth gives us the historical record. All we have to do is just to dig far enough in the earth, and the further you go, the more you see us. Those are the skeletal remains. The more recent skeletal remains are the Asian skeletal remains, and of course now the European skeletal remains. But the concept, let's go back to the concept of belligerent occupancy. The colonial powers who did that are deemed in international law that as belligerent occupiers. It's being based upon the possession of our territory, and it implies the sovereignty of the occupied territory. It implies that the sovereignty is not vested with the occupying power. The power of the United States over us is provisional. The provision is that we have to take a declaration, and this is the reason why we ask for your declarations of independence, just like they took one from England, to declare themselves a unique people, to declare themselves a people outside of that power. Once we do that, then we have asserted our right, our human right to make a choice, our human right not for them to choose a convenient category for us so that they can lord over us like simple minority, but to put us in the category of being this special minority who has the right to land and has the right to sovereignty. These Justin Bellow laws is law that governs the way that warfare is conducted. This Justin Bellow law that governs the way that war is conducted is now modernized into, and I'll show you that next. It's now modernized into, and this is another term, just ad bellum. It distinguishes between wars of aggression amounting to crimes against peace and a war of self-defense. These have been codified into the Geneva Convention. One, because it relates to civilians in war theaters, and we are civilians in this occupied civilians in this war theater. This is our argument to the UN. This was in our paper, in our legal brief to the UN, as to our status, our true status, our standing, and our which means our place in our that we're arguing this from. And we used these conventions which is the UN conventions, to move the case forward. This is the main document here that is the basis of our filing for decolonization in the UN Decolonization Committee. And I'll let you read this, and then I will paraphrase it, our argument. The U.S. government has become a colonial power because its legislations, practices, and policies associated with colonialism. That is, it attempts to annex the territory that it is occupying and administers in a way that denies the territory's people the right to self-determination. This defines the conduct of the United States in relation to annexing us as well as our territory, and denying us up until this point the right to self-determination, which they can't deny because the United States signed the Declaration of Human Rights. They signed the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that gives people, all people, the right to self-determination, which is what we asserted and what they asserted in their argument with England. And I'll get down to bullet point 2, because we are now going into these discussions over natural resources, because as an indigenous people, now we can negotiate over our territories and the national resources that go along with those territories. And we do that because politics is an endeavor of basically who gets what. That's what politics is who gets what. And due to their configurations of putting us in the simple minority category, we wouldn't have gotten anything. We get red line gentrification pushed out of our areas and beat on the head if we say anything about it. That's the category that the U.S. put us in, and that we just came out of, and we wish you to come out of too, by asserting your right to self-determination and asserting your right to be decolonized and asserting your right to nationhood. Nations have tremendous power. They have tremendous wealth because the wealth of a nation is based upon the people within that nation. So our 5,000 citizens are really good, and I really applaud everyone's effort, all of the organizations, all the Indian tribes that assisted us. But we are not at the point that we can seriously negotiate more than for those 5,000 citizens. We wish to negotiate, or be in the point for you to put us in the seat to negotiate with 100,000 citizens, with 1 million citizens. This will give us tremendous power in choosing or not choosing the next president of the United States. We want to be able to negotiate for, number one, our recognition, number two, the integrity of our territories, and the right to have autonomy over them. We want to negotiate our educational system because we want to take our kids and put them into a special school districts so that they can really be taught properly. We want to have state-of-the-art schools. We want to be able to obtain aid from the United Nations and other nations of the world for our infrastructure so that we can rehab and rehabilitate our communities. We do so because this is a issue of urgency right now, because the United States, its think tank, its economists have now, through shaking us out of our houses, redlining us, gerrymandering us, that's not enough. Now they have put us into the position of trying to put us in the position of making us zero-sum slaves, are very poor. Let me give you this video on our present condition and why we must take appropriate action to get ourselves out of the condition that they have put us into. This is the road to zero wealth. This is their ambition, is to take us out of our wealth and to assume it, and this is their record of doing just that.
This is the Real News Network, and I'm your host, Jessel Noor. Not only is America's racial wealth gap increasing, if unaddressed, it's actually going to wipe out wealth for communities of color in less than 4 decades. That's the finding of a shocking new report called Road to Zero Wealth: How the Racial Wealth Divide is Hollowing Out America's Middle Class. Now joining us is one of the study's co-authors, Diedrich Asante Mohammed. He's a senior fellow at Prosperity Now, where he heads up the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So you really have to be blind to not see that America has a tremendous racial wealth gap. But talk about how you came to this conclusion, that there will be zero wealth in communities of color in 2053 if things aren't addressed.
Well, let me first just to comment on your first statement that you have to be blind to not recognize racial wealth inequality, because that is true. Then it's apparent that a good portion of the population is blind. There's been some recent reports from Yale and from the New York Times and Washington Post how white Americans feel that African Americans and Latinos are doing much better as it relates to economic equality than they really are. And so that's part of the reason that the report is put forward, is just to help give the true stats and highlight the reality of the great inequality that exists. So in 2013, we have some of the most recent wealth data. White Americans have a median wealth of $117,000. Blacks have a median wealth of $1,700, and Latinos have a median wealth of $2,000. And a big crisis, a big concern is that Black wealth has been going down since 2001. Latino wealth has been going down rapidly with the Great Recession. And that if we look over the last 30 years, from 1983 to 2013, we see that there's actually a degrade of Black and Latino wealth. And if things keep going from the same way it has been from 1983 to 2013, we see that Black wealth will see a median Black wealth of 0 by 2053, and a median Latino wealth of 0 by 2073. And during those time periods, white wealth will continue to increase, though not quickly, but will continue to increase if things keep going where they have been between 1983 and 2013.
And so your first comment sort of touches upon how this racial wealth gap was created, how much of wealth in middle-class white communities was created through government housing policies that resulted in segregation and advancement for white communities that African American and other communities of color didn't have access to. And that sort of resulted, one of the byproducts of that, or one of the, not even byproducts, one of the intentional results of that is this dramatic segregation we see in our society, so that people don't have insight into how other communities are doing.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of myths out there that lead us to having a wrong understanding of how the world functions. I think most people don't understand that the country hasn't historically always been a predominantly middle-class country. That really arose building off of the New Deal following the Great Depression, and with the development of GI Bill and a very, very strong economy in the late 40s and 50s post World War II. And so, it wasn't until after these programs had been implemented and there was massive investment into a middle class that you see whites becoming majority homeowners for the first time and creating this broad, fairly prosperous middle class, which was a white middle class. Because obviously, when you're having policies in the 40s and 50s, even if at the federal level, they didn't say that African Americans or people of color couldn't participate, they were implemented in a very segregationist manner. You had outright racial discrimination in the law, through the 60s. And so we had this massive investment in a time of legal segregation, legal racial disenfranchisement, which meant that the resources, and it's been estimated that more money went into the creation of the American middle class during this time period than went into the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. So we're talking about massive amounts of funds that went to and it was very successful. It created a very strong white middle class. And the challenge today is that as the population of the country increases to include more and more people of color, we're finding that the largest groups in these people of color, Latinos, African Americans, a smaller group, Native Americans, have never attained that financial security, which really is wealth, which allows you to be in the American middle class. And that's where we are today, with great disparities, even among African Americans and whites who are making the same amount of income. We see massive amounts of wealth disparity. One other thing I'll highlight is that even in terms of education, we see that whites with a high school degree make more wealth than blacks with a 4-year college degree. They have more wealth. So again, the disparities go up and down the economic chain for African Americans and Latinos, as well as the educational ladder.
And talk about some of the institutions and factors that continue to drive this increasing racial wealth gap today. We know, obviously, mass incarceration, unequal access to education. There's lots of different systems in play here, but what do you think are the biggest drivers of this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one thing it's important to note is that the economy over the last 30 years has been much more of a regressive economy. I mean, even for whites, you see a greater concentration of wealth among the top. Part of the challenge is, though, that even low-income whites have more wealth than the median wealth for African Americans. And so even in an aggressive economy, the white middle class is managing to hold on while kind of emerging Black Latino middle class in terms of income is not finding that wealth stability. So there's an overall regressive economy that's happening. And then, I'll also put forward that, we spend over $650 billion a year in wealth and asset development. And that's a lot of money. And so we would think, well, this should be helping, those who are low wealth attain more of a middle class status. But the challenge with that $650 billion is most of that disproportionately goes to the wealthy. So we are actually investing in further concentration of wealth, and we're investing in maintaining and creating a larger racial wealth divide every year with the numbers of over $650 billion. So we could turn right side up this upside down tax system and make sure that wealth and asset development actually goes to low wealth communities instead of high wealth communities.
So we know that the Trump administration is the wealthiest administration in history. Heading these different, cabinet positions are millionaires and billionaires that have made their fortune sort of plundering the middle class. What you're talking about now. So knowing this, knowing that extracting demands from them are going to be difficult. What should these demands be that people should be organizing around now to address this?
Yeah, well, I think, one important piece I would note is that the Great Recession, allowed for a massive deregulation that kind of took advantage of a middle class that was being left behind, that, people who wanted to become homeowners for the first time and put into mortgages that they couldn't afford, and then were leveraged over and over and over again by Wall Street to make much money off of these loans that were not created to actually sustain themselves. And so, one thing we got to make sure we do is that we don't deregulate again and go back to this kind of predatory economy where Wall Street actually can make a quick buck, but then get bailed out by the government. But the people who lose their homes are just left with massive wealth deficits. So I think that's one important piece. And then again, we'll point to the tax code. I think one thing that was interesting in the last election cycle was that both Trump and Bernie Sanders were talking about the need for raising taxes on the wealthy, and that the American economy has gotten away from this idyllic idea of a strong middle class economy that supported all people. I think a disappointing thing is that when President Trump has gotten into office, his rhetoric is not matching what is being discussed in the White House for reforms in the tax policy. It is looking like it'll just go further down this path, where right now the average millionaire is getting over $160,000 of value off of the current asset development policies, while the working class families only getting $200. So we have to be willing to fight that and actually fight for a much more progressive tax structure to make sure we maintain a strong middle class economy.
And finally, the Trump administration has also set its sights on the estate tax, which tax wealth that is passed down, which is a lot of, which also helps perpetuate this wealth gap. Can you talk about the importance of maintaining or expanding that?
Yeah, the estate tax, I believe sometimes people call it the death tax, conservatives call it the death tax. And, I think it's important to note that it is that, wealth that is transferred from one generation when they pass to the next would be taxed, and they want to cut that. But there's already, I think, a ceiling of none of this is being taxed unless it's over $5 million if it's from a couple. So, that's only the wealthiest of Americans that have over $5 million and then are going to pass it on to the next generation, and then will face this tax. So I think, we have to really be strong in saying, we're not going to worry about taxing the wealthiest Americans who are most benefiting from our society. We're going to actually work to make sure that we still create a society where we have a strong economy, which means we need investments in low wealth communities. And of course, that investment's should disproportionately come from the wealthiest Americans.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us, Diedrich Asante Mohammed. The new report is called The Road to Zero Wealth. We'll link to that on our website, therealnews.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us at The Real
News. Let's talk about this wealth, and let's talk about the intersectionality between reparation and national and liberation. There's an intersectionality that we have to discuss in real terms. The reason why I showed you that clip is because we are in a very precarious state if we do not move swiftly to nationalize our assets. They are being deteriorated by tax cuts and by the Republicans and the Democrats parties. They are at war with us. So it is incredible, the naive of certain reparationists and groups to think that the Congress and the Senate is going to vote to empower, give you reparations. Number one, they would write the legislation, and they're the defendants, so they're not going to write it in a fair way. Number two, they would not even get to the point of writing the legislation because one of the groups had a bill that has been in a virtual wastebasket for 30 years. Has not ever came out of a committee even to get to the floor to even talk about reparations. So these candidates that are now saying that they would be for the study of reparations, that they would be for reparations, are incredibly deceitful. The intersectionality between reparations and liberation is that nationalization is the first step of reparations. When you look at the international law on reparations, it's codified in UN Resolution 60/147. The first remedy for decolonized people and formerly enslaved people is liberty. So the first step to being repaired is nationalization. What the 5,000 citizens have chosen to do to this point, and hopefully many more that will declare, they've already repaired their identity. They've already are moving to have their own school districts and have their own food security and to have control over the policing in their areas. This is reparations. This is called, it's not something that comes from somebody, just not something that comes from the defendants to the people that they harm, but it's also the ability for those who have been harmed to repair themselves to the extent that now that they can make a legitimate demand. We can't, the current people that have not studied the international approach somehow seem to think that if they write a bill or allow the defendants to write a bill, that is going to repair us. That is wishful fantasy thinking that has no logical basis to it. It just does. It just defies logic. The other thing, or the approach of nationalization, is an approach that all people have the right to do, and the people that have been repaired, such as Israel, has chosen that. Our approach is much like the Israeli approach, which began in a court but didn't end in a court. It began with claims for reparations for different items that were taken from the Jews during the German and Polish and the European occupation of and move during World War II. Those cases were consolidated and taken by the State Department. Say, "Whoa, we can't resolve this at this level." And so reparations are their claims. Their $60 to $80 billion claims for reparations. It ended up in the International Settlement of Banks. You can look that up. International Settlement of Banks. This is where our reparations argument would end up. It won't end up in a court or before Congress. That doesn't make any sense. They can't give us the 60 to 80 to $100 billion to $1 trillion, whatever that amount is. They don't have the capacity because they've been slaveholders and slaves and using racial suppression as a theory for over 300-400 years. For us to think, for some of us to think that now we can give them a bill and they're going to sign it and everything's going to be happy is ridiculous. We as a collective nation, like Israel and like the Japanese and like the Sudanese and like the Iraqs and the people that Armenians who have obtained reparations, they have done so out of their national posture, because that's just how it goes. Because we are not even a people. We are a simple minority individual in the United States. So we have no collective rights under the rubric of laws in the United States. So we could not even obtain collective reparations under that rubric of laws because we have no identity. Let's talk about our identity, because that is our strong point as who we are. Who are we? Let's see what David Imhotep says.
Good things happen when you have an environment of commitment and dedication. Not just talked about, but lived. Lessons of our past, issues of our future.
Okay, we learned a lot in school about 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and all that stuff. But you know what? There were Africans before Columbus, and we've got Dr. David Imhotep to tell us his history lesson that we need to know. Welcome, Dr. Imhotep. And I should say, you have a PhD in ancient African history.
That's correct.
And that's kind of unusual.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. How did you get interested in this area?
It was part of my dissertation led this way, but I could not vary to another subject when my other subject here. So I said, later on, I will write something about that because it's not important in my dissertation at this moment. So that's why I did the book as soon as I finished my dissertation.
Wow, and we should say, and we have a picture of the book too, and it's the first Americans were Africans, and we were talking about Dr. Ivan Van Sertima because I remember back in the 1980s, my dad took me to hear him. He came here to Cincinnati, and his book was They Came Before Columbus, and he talked about you know, how Africans were here. He had a lot of, I mean, great research information, and so it was just kind of eye-opening, but we haven't heard a lot about that recently. So tell us how you got involved here.
Well, I'm showing that Africans not only came before Columbus, they came before the Indians.
So you're going even farther back.
I'm going farther back, at least 56,000 years old.
Okay, now we've got a graphic up here about 130,000 years ago.
Yeah, well, they sailed over here. And when I lecture, people say, well, wait a minute, humans weren't sailing, let alone they weren't boating 130,000 years ago. And I beg to differ. Last year, New York Times quoted the BBC, and they wrote an article on how in Crete they have found a stone industry of stone tools going back to at least 130,000 years. And Crete has been an island in the middle of the Mediterranean for 5 million years. So they had to sail, and it was a continuous civilization, which means they were going back and forth. They knew how to navigate. So if they got to Crete 130,000 years ago, it's easy 70,000 years later that they could make it to the Americas at 56,000 years ago.
Right. That's really, now how did you even get back to this research? I mean, this is just, you know, did you start by reading They Came Before Columbus, and then you expanded on that research?
Yes. You see, 36 years ago, Dr. Van Sertima's book came out, and this information is piled on for 36 years. So many different things, so many cutting-edge articles and things have been found since then.
Yeah, and so, and what's the reaction you get when you talk about how Africans came here even before Native Americans?
People are amazed. They're shocked. They're shocked. First come shocks, and then they're smiling, and some frown, of course.
And then, you know, and what about the school systems? Because, you know, have we gotten this information to the educational system? Not
yet. The book has only been out for a month and a half.
And what kind of feedback are you getting, though, when you go around and talk about this? I mean, I'm assuming you're doing lectures around the country.
Yeah, well, I always bring my peer-reviewed articles.
Okay.
Because my thesis, which is the same as my title, The First Americans Were Africans, is backed up by 7, soon to be 8, peer-reviewed journal articles, which is the height of academia.
Wow. And so you've got credibility. I mean, people can see this research. What do you think? Do you think this is going to change history at all?
Well, for hundreds of years in Europe, people thought the world was flat, and it took a while for them to be able to say the world was round in order to go out there and navigate and see that it was indeed round. So it's going to take a little while for them to get around this, but it will happen.
Well, and tell us a little bit about these Africans who came before the Indians, before Columbus.
Okay, they came here, and they were first. They came to Pedro Fiorita, which is northeastern Brazil, and you'll see that that's the closest point from Africa to South America. And by canoe, a fellow, a navigator who was a doctor, wanted to prove that it could be done just in a canoe, and he set out in a canoe with a supply ship, but it did not touch him. He had a canoe with no oars, no paddle, no sail, nothing. He just sat there, and the currents took him straight from Africa to here. You've heard about people, if you throw a bottle in the water with a note, it'll come over. Yes, there are rivers in the ocean, currents, and it took him 52 days only. So you put a large sail on that vessel, and you get here in less than a month.
So it's definitely possible. We know that. It's physically possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what part of Africa were the Africans from who came to Brazil?
Well, the DNA, the Genome Project has found that the earliest ones, the ones that they found in Tierra del Fuego, in the very tip of South America, in 1874, 1876, were the short Africans, the Khoisan, who spoke with clicks, like that. The Gods Must Be Crazy did a movie on that.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Yes. So they have
about the Coca-Cola bottle that fell in, yeah.
Yes, they have the oldest DNA and the oldest language on the planet, and they were all over.
Oh, wow.
All over all three Americas, as well as Asia.
Well, have they done any DNA tests in Brazil to see that?
Yes, they have. The Genome Project went all around the world. There are 100,000 people participated.
Wow.
Taking DNA swabs.
And so first we know that it's possible to get over here by canoe, and second of all, the DNA from that group of Africans is in Brazil.
The most important thing, not to forget to ask me, well, I will tell you that, where do the Native Americans come from? Well, we've always been taught that they came across the Bering Straits from Asia. This is true, but they did not come until 3000 BC. There is no evidence of them coming before 3000 BC. So for 53,000 years, there were nothing but Africans in North, Central, and South America.
Wow.
When they come over 3000 BC, those two groups, the Africans and the Mongolians, get together, the Asians, get together, and their children are the Native Americans.
Wow.
This is why the Native Americans do not look Chinese. They are a little different than Chinese.
Right. Oh, that's, you know what, I mean, we need to learn. It makes a lot of sense, Dr. Imhotep, and we need to learn our history.
Yes.
So I think it's fantastic that you've written this book, and I know people are wondering, how did they get the first Americans were Africans, documented evidence. I love this. And it's by Dr. David Imhotep. How do we get this book? I have a phone number.
Amazon.com.
Okay, Amazon.com.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's easy, Amazon.com. And Jeff is saying, give us that phone number, too, to order the book, and I have 540-772-1943.
That is correct.
Okay, so that's another phone number, 540-772-1943.
Because I do presentations for the book as well, 150 slide presentations, and that's where my people get me through my website, which is historictruth.info, historictruth.info. Okay, or they can just Google my name, David Imhotep.
And I was going to say, of course, we would link you to Dr. Imhotep through WLWT.com, because people, universities, schools can call you to come and speak. This is really important research, and we need to know more about this.
Thank you so much.
So I can't wait to finish reading the book. This is great. The First Americans Were Africans by Dr. David Imhotep. Thank you so much for coming. You have to come back.
Thank you.
All right, stick with us. We'll be back in a moment with some calendar events.
I really love our scholars, Dr. David Imhotep, Dr. Claude A. Winters. We are now in the final workings out of our contractual relationships, and we're going to be talking about these triple citizenship, because I too have wrote about our sojourn, our world sojourn to come to the United States. In fact, I started doing this with the because of some of the failures of the reparation lawyers in trying to obtain standing before U.S. courts. So one of the questions was who are we? and why do we have a collective standing? And so the research led me to Dr. David M. Hoptep, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, a slew of other scholars and scientists and DNA experts, and to the extent that now we have the evidence to show who we are, and we are in our final talks and negotiations, because it has to be put in courses and in books and in films, because we now know our identity. And this is something, and identity has a very important evidentiary and legal basis for standing. So we're not just simple minority citizens to be sloughed off by the United States. We are an indigenous people, and we have the evidence because of our scholarship to show. We have a combined 70, 80 years of study on this. And so it's going to be extremely exciting to talk about triple citizenship. Now we don't have to be regulated to just one simple minority category. We have Confederation citizenship. We still retain American citizenship. We have the right for African citizenship, because we are a combination and a very unique people that have all of this historical accrements to be able to assert 3 different citizenships. So be aware that I'm going to have those scholars on, that we will be back in a continuing series, hopefully weekly, except for 1 or 2 weeks, because we have a huge announcement that we are about to make, because of the fact that our people have been wise enough to put us over the 5,000 citizenship goal. We have more than 5,000 citizens, 100 organizations, but we want you to go to our sites, adihr.us. That's adihr.us. There's a declaration form that will give you power and give us power to be able to negotiate. We no longer need to beg for legislation. When you are in a national posture, a national forum, nations don't beg other nations. Nations negotiate with other nations. We are now at that dignified level where we can do that. We want to have the power to be able to not only do that, but for you to give us the leverage. It's a very different leverage of having 5,000 citizens as opposed to having 100,000 citizens or 1 million citizens. We know that just 100,000 citizens could choose the next president of the United States, which gives us tremendous power to obtain everything that we need. The minimum position that we would like to go into those talks prior to the 2020 elections is 100,000 citizens. It takes less than 3 minutes to fill out that declaration form. Please do that today. This gives us power. Not voting in a Democrat or election doesn't give you any power. It gets rid of one jerk and puts in another jerk to oppress you. And you call it the lesser of 2 evils, and we call it the enabling the oppressor. We want to be able to negotiate with that oppressor so he cannot be that oppressive, that we can obtain our piece of this pie, which is ours, and they are occupying power. We want to obtain that territory, and we want to succeed to being the 12th wealthiest entity in the world. We have the dollars, the collective dollars, to do this. This is the unknown, untold secret that we are revealing, and we will reveal throughout this process. By the way, we have books. we have a book called The Process, Civil Rights to Human Rights, in which we explain how to obtain reparations through the first step of nationalization. You cannot beg a man that has beaten you, destroyed you, and then ask for, can you help us? You have to put yourself in a posture of being able to negotiate with that man. And we know that demand and power only comes through the power of negotiation, how much power you have. So that dictates what kind of result that you're going to obtain. So we entreat you to go to our website, to come to the webinars, to soak up this information so that you can explain politics for the first time, because the Congressional Black Caucus, that's not politics. That's a few Black people in Congress with no power. In fact, they are so powerless that they have been sold, that they had to sell out to get comforts, personal comforts. The Congressional Black Caucus signed a program called 1033, which gave the American police military equipment, surplus military equipment. So that's why you see all the SWAT gear and all the military equipment, all those weapons. The Congressional Black Caucus did that. They helped do that. Then they also voted to put the police in a special class over us. Then they just voted to allow the Israelis, you can't, Zionists, getting to a point where we can't even criticize them, which is a breach of our First Amendment constitutional rights. So this movement to change the system from the inside out hasn't panned out because it's ridiculous. A minority can't do that. It's just numerically impossible. We don't have the Congress people. We definitely don't have the judges and the courts to change any laws or to change any interpretations of the Constitution. Trump has, when Wildhat has appointed more judges to the federal judiciary system than any president in history. So the judiciary system is stacked against us. The police systems is stacked against us by being a simple minority. So that's not wise. So it is a better posture to say, that's your way you want to do it. This is how we want to do it. Let's talk about it. Let's negotiate. And we can only negotiate from a point of power. So we need those declarations. They mean something. They really mean something. And they give us the power to push this peace through the United Nations. We're already there. We're not telling you about something. In fact, I think I have this request. I brought it up, and I'm hoping that you can see it. I'm gonna share our request to the United Nations decolonization with everybody that's here. And you can reshare it with everybody. You should have it on your screen. Let me see if I can bring it up. Can I screen share it? No, okay, I can't screen share it, but I've downloaded the file for you. I downloaded the file for you, and if you don't have our request to the United Nations based upon who we are and our request to decolonize, please get it, because you will see that we are straight shooters. We go right to the point, and we are asserting our right to a remedy. It's more than a complaint, our request. This is the right to obtain anywhere from at least $10 billion of infrastructure money from various countries of the world, Russia, China, whoever it is that wants to give us infrastructure money. We are ready and willing and able to accept it even at this point. Give us the power to really rehabilitate and our money. We are going to make a huge announcement in less than 30 days. We want you to stay tuned and absorb this way, understand this way, understand who you are, understand your power, and your ability to be able to alleviate yourself from the suppression that has been oppressing us for all of these years. I thank you so much for attending today. You will this broadcast is going to be on YouTube. I will make it's going to be available to you before the end of the day for your replay. It's on my channel, Dr. Mustafa Ansari, YouTube. Just go on YouTube and Dr. Mustafa Ansari YouTube. You'll see all of our lessons. This is lesson 6. You'll see all of our lessons on decolonization, of step by step of how we did it and why we're doing it, and you'll see the documents, and hopefully you'll get that document, request for decolonization, that's in the United Nations right now. Not going to be in the United Nations, but in the United Nations right now. And we're about to make another move very shortly. Stay tuned. It's always power to the people. Greetings. I leave you with how I greeted you, with peace and power. Peace.